This is the point in the story where things usually go off the rails. Lost civilizations, alien engineers, ancient power plants lighting up the Nile. You've heard these claims before, and most of them collapse under scrutiny. So let's be clear from the start. There is no credible evidence that extraterrestrials built the Great Pyramid. No non-human materials, no anomalous isotopes, no ancient texts describing visitors from the stars. Serious researchers reject those ideas outright, and so should we. But rejecting bad explanations doesn't mean the mystery disappears. It just means we're left with harder questions. Some fringe researchers argue the pyramid functioned as a power plant, generating energy through chemical reactions involving groundwater, zinc compounds, and acidic solutions. This idea, popularized by Christopher Dunn, suggests the Queen's chamber may have housed reactants, producing hydrogen or electrical effects. Is there proof? No. There is no residue confirming chemical reactions, no pipes, no corrosion patterns that definitively support the claim. But there's also no evidence of burial activity. So the power plant theory sits in an uncomfortable gray zone, not proven, but not easily dismissed without replacing it with something better. Other theories propose the pyramid was designed as a seismic stabilizer, using its mass and geometry to dampen Earth vibrations along fault lines beneath the Giza Plateau. Modern engineers use similar principles in skyscrapers and bridges. This idea is intriguing because it requires no advanced technology, just empirical observation of how stone behaves under stress. But again, there's no ancient text confirming such intent. Then there are the acoustic ritual theories. Some researchers suggest the pyramid was used for sound-based ceremonies, chanting, resonance, or consciousness-altering experiences. Ancient cultures worldwide associated sound with creation, transformation, and divinity. The pyramid's chambers undeniably resonate. Sound behaves differently inside them. That's measurable. What's not measurable is intent. Were these acoustic properties exploited intentionally, or are they a byproduct of stone architecture? That's the line we can't cross without speculation. And finally, there's the most conservative alternative of all, yet still radical by Egyptological standards. That the Great Pyramid was a multi-purpose structure, not a machine, not a tomb, but a convergence of symbolism, science, ritual, and state power. A structure meant to reflect cosmic order, encode knowledge, and demonstrate absolute control over labor, materials, and mathematics. In this view, the pyramid wasn't meant to do one thing, it was meant to mean something, across dimensions we no longer fully grasp. This theory has an advantage. It doesn't require lost technology, it doesn't invoke aliens, it doesn't contradict known Egyptian culture, but it still forces us to admit something uncomfortable. That ancient civilizations may have understood geometry, resonance, and natural forces at a level we've underestimated. And that modern categories, tomb, temple, machine, may be too narrow to describe what the Great Pyramid actually is. Which brings us to the final reckoning. Because after all the scans, studies, theories, and debates, we're still left standing in the shadow of a structure that refuses to explain itself. And that silence may be the most important clue of all. For over 100 years, the explanation seemed settled. According to mainstream Egyptology, the Great Pyramid was constructed during Egypt's 4th dynasty, around 2560 BCE, as a tomb for the Pharaoh Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops. It was, we're told, the ultimate expression of royal power, a mountain of stone designed to guarantee the king's immortality in the afterlife. This idea didn't come from inscriptions inside the pyramid, because there are none, but from context. Other pyramids in Egypt, particularly later ones, were tombs. They contained burial chambers, sarcophagi, funerary texts, grave goods, and walls covered in spells meant to guide the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife. So historians assumed the Great Pyramid must be the same. But right away, there was a problem. The Great Pyramid is the only pyramid at Giza with no inscriptions of any kind inside it. No cartouches, no prayers, no instructions for the soul, no references to Khufu at all. The only object resembling a burial container is a plain granite box in the king's chamber, often called a sarcophagus, but it lacks inscriptions, decoration, or even a lid, and its dimensions don't match any known Old Kingdom burial customs. Egyptologists explained this away. Perhaps it was looted in antiquity. Perhaps the inscriptions were never added. Perhaps Khufu wanted simplicity. But the deeper researchers looked, the stranger those excuses sounded. Because even heavily looted royal tombs, like those in the Valley of the Kings, still leave traces behind. Broken seals, shards of grave goods, residual iconography, something. Inside the Great Pyramid? Nothing. No evidence that a funeral ever took place there at all. And yet, the tomb narrative became doctrine. By the early 20th century, questioning it was considered fringe. Academic careers were built on refining details of burial theory, not challenging its foundation. Textbooks repeated the claim. Museums echoed it. Tour guides recited it daily. But engineers, people trained to ask why something is built the way it is, were about to notice something historians had largely ignored. Tombs are symbolic structures. They are ritualistic. They prioritize meaning over performance. The Great Pyramid does the opposite. Its design prioritizes precision, load distribution, thermal stability, and geometric accuracy at levels unnecessary and frankly absurd for a burial monument. For example, its base is leveled to within 2 centimeters across 230 meters, a feat that rivals modern engineering projects. Its 4 sides are aligned to true north, with an error of less than 0.05 degrees, making it one of the most precisely oriented structures on Earth. Even today, achieving that level of alignment without GPS would be a challenge. So the question slowly shifted from how did they build it to something far more uncomfortable. Why would they build a tomb like this? Especially when other confirmed tombs, both before and after Khufu, were far simpler, cheaper, and easier to construct. Then there's the internal architecture. The pyramid doesn't center around a burial chamber. Instead, it features an intricate system of ascending passages, pressure-relieving chambers, corbelled ceilings, and narrow shafts that serve no obvious funerary purpose. The Grand Gallery alone is a 47-meter-long, 8.6-meter-high stone corridor with perfectly angled walls and a stepped floor, more reminiscent of a structural load distribution system than a ceremonial hallway. No wall art, no inscriptions, no ritual objects, just geometry and stone. A lot of stone. By the mid-20th century, a few researchers began quietly pointing this out. Engineers like Christopher Dunn, aerospace machinist turned pyramid analyst, asked a simple question. If this were a machine, or at least a functional structure, what problem would it be solving? That question would change everything. Because once you stop assuming the Great Pyramid is a tomb, you're forced to confront something far stranger. Not what ancient Egyptians believed, but what they knew. And to understand that, we need to look at the pyramid the way engineers do, not as a monument, but as a system. A system where every chamber, angle, and material choice might serve a purpose. And that brings us to the granite. Because limestone is easy to explain, granite is not. If the Great Pyramid were merely a tomb, limestone alone would have been more than sufficient. Limestone was abundant. It was easy to quarry. It was already used extensively in Egyptian monuments. But deep inside the pyramid, far from where tourists walk today, engineers found something that raised serious questions. Granite. Not just a little granite, not decorative granite, but massive structural granite blocks weighing 40 to 80 tons each, transported from Aswan, nearly 900 kilometers south of Giza. Even today, moving stones of that size is a logistical nightmare. Granite is harder than limestone, it's far more difficult to cut, and it wears down tools at an astonishing rate. For a burial monument, it makes no economic or practical sense. But for engineers, granite immediately signals something else. Because granite isn't just strong, it's piezoelectric. Under mechanical stress, granite and the quartz crystals inside it can generate small electrical charges. This property is well known in modern engineering. Quartz oscillators power watches, computers, radios, and precision timing devices. And the Great Pyramid doesn't just use granite randomly. It uses it strategically. The King's Chamber is entirely lined with granite, from floor to ceiling. Above it sit 5 massive granite and limestone layers known as the relieving chambers, designed not for decoration, but for stress redistribution. These chambers prevent catastrophic collapse by spreading weight outward. That's not ritual design. That's load engineering. The granite beams above the King's Chamber are cut with tolerances that modern stonemasons still struggle to replicate. Tool marks suggest techniques far more precise than copper chisels should allow, something Egyptologists explain as lost methods, but never fully detail. Then there's the acoustics. In the 1990s, acoustic engineers began experimenting inside the King's Chamber. They discovered that the room resonates strongly at specific low frequencies, particularly around 440 Hz, the same frequency modern music tuning standards gravitate toward. When sound is introduced at these frequencies, vibrations propagate throughout the chamber in predictable, measurable ways. Again, this doesn't prove intent, but it raises an uncomfortable question. Why design a burial chamber with acoustic resonance properties? No Egyptian funerary text mentions sound-based rituals inside sealed stone chambers. No other tomb in Egypt shows anything remotely similar. Then there's the air shafts, often misleadingly called ventilation shafts. They don't ventilate. 2 shafts exit the King's Chamber. 2 more exit the Queen's Chamber. They are narrow, precisely angled, and terminate at different external points. For decades, Egyptologists claimed these shafts were symbolic, pathways for the pharaoh's soul to reach the stars. But the alignments aren't symbolic guesses. They are mathematically precise. The southern shaft of the King's Chamber once aligned with Orion's belt around 2500 BCE. The northern shaft pointed toward the region of the circumpolar stars, associated with immortality in Egyptian cosmology. Symbolic? Possibly. But engineers noticed something else. These shafts are smooth, straight, and geometrically consistent, traits associated with waveguides in modern physics. Waveguides are structures that channel energy, sound, or electromagnetic waves with minimal loss. That doesn't mean the Egyptians were transmitting radio signals, but it does mean the structure behaves in ways tombs don't. And then, in 2018, a study published in the Journal of Applied Physics found something even stranger. When exposed to certain electromagnetic wavelengths, the Great Pyramid concentrates and amplifies energy in specific internal chambers, particularly the King's Chamber and the area beneath the pyramid. This wasn't fringe speculation. It was a peer-reviewed physics paper. The authors were careful. They didn't claim ancient power plants or lost technology. They simply reported that the pyramid's geometry causes it to interact with electromagnetic waves in unexpected ways. Still, the implications were hard to ignore. Granite, resonance, wave concentration, precision alignment. Individually, these facts might be coincidences. Together, they form a pattern. And patterns are exactly what engineers are trained to notice. Which brings us to a question Egyptology rarely asks. If the Great Pyramid were a machine, or at least a functional system, what was its input, and what was its output? To answer that, we need to look not at what's inside the pyramid, but what's underneath it. Because the Giza Plateau wasn't chosen randomly, and beneath it lies something even older than the pyramid itself. Long before Khufu's builders laid the first limestone block, the Giza Plateau already stood apart from the surrounding desert. Geologists noticed this before archaeologists did. Unlike much of the Nile Valley, Giza sits on a dense limestone bedrock formation riddled with natural fissures, cavities, and subterranean chambers. In some places, these voids predate the pyramid by tens of thousands of years, carved not by human hands, but by groundwater erosion during a wetter climatic era. And that matters, because ancient builders didn't just place the Great Pyramid on the plateau, they integrated it into the bedrock itself. The lowest courses of the pyramid are carved directly from living stone. The so-called subterranean chamber lies deep below the pyramid's base, unfinished, rough, and unlike any other internal space. Egyptologists have long called it an abandoned burial chamber, an early mistake corrected later in construction. But engineers weren't convinced. The chamber's floor is uneven, its ceiling is jagged, and it connects to a descending passage that plunges downward at a precise 26.3-degree angle, the same angle used elsewhere in the structure. If this chamber were abandoned, why keep it connected? If it were symbolic, why leave it unfinished? And if it were a tomb, why put it below the groundwater table? Because today, the subterranean chamber often floods. That fact alone should have ended the tomb theory. Ancient Egyptians were meticulous about preserving the body. They engineered tombs to stay dry, sealed, and protected for eternity. Flood-prone underground chambers are the last place you'd store a pharaoh's remains. But what if water wasn't a problem? What if it was part of the design? This is where mainstream archaeology and engineering quietly diverge. In the late 20th century, civil engineers studying the plateau noticed that the Giza bedrock sits atop an aquifer, a naturally occurring groundwater system that once flowed more actively than it does today. Some researchers propose that water, pressure, and vibration could interact with the pyramid's internal structures. That idea sounds speculative, until you remember something important. The ancient Egyptians were masters of hydraulics. They built canals, flood basins, nilometers, and water regulation systems centuries before Rome. They understood how moving water could lift stones, power mechanisms, and stabilize foundations. Christopher Dunn proposed that the subterranean chamber may have acted as a hydraulic pulse chamber, where groundwater movement created vibrations transmitted upward through the structure. The descending passage, in this interpretation, wasn't abandoned. It was an access channel. Is that proven? No. But here's the problem. The tomb explanation doesn't work either. There is no evidence that the subterranean chamber ever held a burial. No sarcophagus, no ritual objects, no sealing mechanism. And unlike later pyramids, the Great Pyramid has no temple inscriptions describing funerary rites associated with it. Everything we know about Khufu's burial comes from texts written centuries later. Then there's the placement. The Great Pyramid is positioned at a location where geological stress lines intersect beneath the plateau. Modern seismic surveys suggest the site naturally channels vibrations. Once again, engineers notice something historians didn't prioritize. The pyramid isn't just sitting on rock, it's interacting with it. That interaction becomes even stranger when we consider the pyramid's internal geometry. The descending passage, ascending passage, grand gallery, queen's chamber, and king's chamber are not randomly placed. They form a vertically integrated system, one that channels forces upward, not downward. Tombs seal, machines circulate. And circulation brings us to the most misunderstood space in the entire structure, the queen's chamber. Because despite its name, no queen was ever buried there. In fact, it may not have been a chamber at all. Despite its name, the queen's chamber has never been associated with any queen, or any burial at all. The name itself is a historical accident, coined by early Arab explorers and later repeated by European scholars who assumed the pyramid followed the same symbolic layout as later royal tombs. But when engineers examined the chamber closely, the label collapsed almost immediately. The Queen's Chamber contains no sarcophagus, no burial niche, no decorative carvings, and no sealing mechanisms. Its walls are plain limestone, its floor is bare, and its ceiling, unlike the flat granite slabs of the King's Chamber, is shaped into a distinctive gabled roof, a structural feature designed to deflect pressure upward. Again, that's not ritual design, that's engineering. Even stranger are the two narrow shafts extending from the Queen's Chamber, hidden behind limestone blocks for thousands of years. Unlike the King's Chamber shafts, these do not exit the pyramid. They stop abruptly behind small stone doors fitted with copper handles. In 1993, a robotic probe built by German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink was sent up one of these shafts. After traveling nearly 65 meters, it encountered a smooth limestone block, polished, sealed, and unmistakably artificial. This wasn't debris. It was a door. When the discovery was announced, Egyptologists were stunned. Tombs don't hide sealed doors inside narrow shafts. There was no funerary precedent for it anywhere in Egypt. A second robotic mission in 2002 drilled through the block and inserted a camera. Behind it was another cavity. And then another door. Two sealed barriers, one behind the other. Why would a burial monument conceal layered access points deep within its structure? The official explanation was vague, symbolic doors for the soul. But symbolism doesn't explain the copper fittings, which are functional elements. Copper was valuable. It oxidizes. It requires intention. Engineers recognize something else. These shafts are angled with extreme precision, matching angles used elsewhere in the pyramid's internal system. Their surfaces are smooth, consistent, and uniform, qualities associated with controlled flow, not symbolic passage. Flow of what? That's the question. In mechanical systems, shafts like these could serve as conduits for air pressure, sound waves, or other forms of energy transfer. Even skeptics admit their purpose is unknown. And then there's the chamber's placement. The Queen's Chamber sits almost exactly at the pyramid's vertical midpoint, not where you'd expect a burial, but exactly where engineers place balancing nodes in tall structures. In resonance-based systems, midpoints are critical. They're where oscillations stabilize. And that brings us back to sound. When acousticians tested the Queen's Chamber, they found it resonates at different frequencies than the King's Chamber. The two rooms respond uniquely to vibration, suggesting they may have been designed as complementary components rather than independent spaces. Again, none of this proves a machine, but it does something just as powerful. It proves the tomb explanation is incomplete, because if the Queen's Chamber had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't burial, then the pyramid's internal logic changes. It stops being a monument with rooms, and starts looking like a system with stages. Stages imply sequence. Sequence implies process. And process implies intent. Which brings us to the most controversial idea of all, not because it's wild, but because it follows the evidence too closely for comfort. What if the Great Pyramid wasn't built to honor the dead, but to do something? To understand that possibility, we have to examine the structure as a whole, not chamber by chamber, but as an integrated design. And that means stepping into the mind of the engineers who studied it last. Not the ancient ones, the modern ones. When engineers look at an unfamiliar structure, they don't ask who built it first. They ask what problem it solves. That shift in perspective is subtle, but it changes everything. Christopher Dunn, a former aerospace machinist who spent decades analyzing the Great Pyramid, approached it the same way he would a jet engine or industrial plant. He cataloged materials, measured tolerances, studied stress paths, modeled vibration behavior. And what emerged wasn't a tomb. It was a system with inputs, processes, and outputs. Consider the vertical layout. At the bottom, the subterranean chamber, embedded in bedrock and interacting with groundwater. In the middle, the Queen's Chamber, sealed, balanced, resonant. Above that, the Grand Gallery, a massive pressure management corridor. At the top, the king's chamber, isolated, granite-lined, structurally buffered. That's not symbolic symmetry. That's staged engineering. In industrial systems, energy often enters at the lowest point, is conditioned or transformed in intermediate stages, and is stabilized or concentrated at the highest point. Now here's where skeptics usually object. There's no evidence of moving parts. There's no fuel residue. There's no exhaust. And they're right. But that assumes a mechanical machine. What if the pyramid wasn't mechanical at all? What if it was passive? Modern engineering relies heavily on passive systems, structures that don't generate energy, but shape, focus, or modulate forces already present in the environment. Antennas don't create signals. Resonators don't create sound. Waveguides don't create energy. They organize it. The Great Pyramid's geometry does exactly that. Its proportions encode mathematical constants, pi, phi, and precise angular ratios that determine how waves propagate through space. Its mass dampens some frequencies while amplifying others. Its chambers resonate differently, creating nodes and antinodes within the structure. In 2018, physicists from ITMO University in Russia published a paper demonstrating that the pyramid's shape can focus electromagnetic energy into specific internal locations when exposed to wavelengths within the radio spectrum. Again, they made no claims about ancient power plants, but the behavior was real, and it was measurable. This brings us to the uncomfortable overlap between architecture and physics. Because ancient Egyptians didn't need to understand Maxwell's equations to exploit resonance. Musical instruments existed thousands of years before acoustic theory. Stone circles were aligned long before astronomy became formalized. You don't need modern science to observe that. Certain shapes amplify sound. Certain materials vibrate differently. Certain alignments matter. What you need is experimentation and time. Lots of time. And Egypt had both. The Great Pyramid may represent the culmination of generations of empirical knowledge. Knowledge encoded not in texts, but in stone. But if that's true, we still face a massive question. Why build something so large, so precise, and so permanent to shape energy at all? That's where theory enters dangerous territory. Some suggest ritual use. Sound, chanting, or harmonic resonance tied to consciousness or ceremony. Others propose more speculative ideas involving energy storage, seismic damping, or even symbolic cosmology expressed through physics. Most Egyptologists reject all of it, and that rejection is important because it reminds us to slow down, to separate what the pyramid does from what it was meant to do. Those are not the same thing. A cathedral resonates acoustically. That doesn't mean it was designed as a musical instrument. A bridge hums in the wind. That doesn't mean it was built to sing. Correlation is not intention. But here's the problem. The Great Pyramid's correlations are everywhere, and they are consistent. At some point, coincidence stops being a satisfying explanation. Which brings us to the fiercest debate of all, the clash between the official story and the engineers who refuse to accept it. Because once the pyramid is viewed as a system, the tomb theory doesn't just look incomplete, it looks obsolete. As soon as engineers began publicly questioning the tomb theory, the response from mainstream Egyptology was swift and firm. The consensus position remains clear. The Great Pyramid was a tomb. Anything else is speculation, and to be fair, Egyptologists have reasons for their caution. There are no ancient Egyptian texts that explicitly describe the pyramid as a machine, an energy device, or a functional system. No blueprints, no manuals, no inscriptions saying, "This structure does something." From an academic standpoint, that absence matters. Archaeology prioritizes direct evidence, texts, artifacts, cultural continuity, and within that framework, alternative interpretations often feel like modern projections imposed onto ancient societies. Skeptics argue that engineers are guilty of retrofitting modern concepts onto ancient structures. that just because something can resonate doesn't mean it was designed to do so. They point out that large stone chambers naturally resonate. Granite has piezoelectric properties, but at extremely small scales. Precise alignment could be symbolic or ceremonial. Ancient builders often over-engineered structures for durability. In other words, the pyramid's behavior may be incidental, not intentional. And this critique is valid. But here's where the tension arises. Because Egyptology itself relies heavily on inference when it comes to the Great Pyramid. There is no burial inscription for Khufu inside it, no funerary papyri describing his interment there, no physical evidence of a mummy ever being present. The attribution of the pyramid to Khufu rests largely on a single piece of graffiti, the so-called quarry marks found in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. Discovered in 1837 by British Colonel Howard Vyse, these red ochre markings include the name Khufu written in a cartouche. To Egyptologists, this seals the case. To skeptics, it opens another one. The marks were found in areas sealed since antiquity, but Vyse used explosives to access them. He was under intense pressure to make a discovery, and some historians have questioned whether the markings were misinterpreted or even altered. There is no definitive proof of forgery, but there is also no independent verification, and that uncertainty matters more than most people realize. Because if the Great Pyramid was Khufu's tomb, it would be the only royal tomb in Egypt that contains no inscriptions, contains no burial goods, contains no mummy, contains no funerary texts, was never referenced as a burial site in contemporary records. That's not impossible, but it is unprecedented. Egyptologists respond by arguing that the Great Pyramid was an early experiment, a prototype before funerary traditions became standardized. Later pyramids were smaller, less precise, and more symbolic. That explanation works, up to a point. What it doesn't explain is why later pyramids abandoned the very precision that made the Great Pyramid extraordinary. If the goal was burial, why make later tombs worse? Why lose the engineering? Why simplify? Unless the Great Pyramid wasn't a prototype, but something else entirely. Something that didn't need to be repeated. Because whatever knowledge went into its construction may not have survived, or may not have been intended to. This is where the debate turns uncomfortable, because now we're no longer arguing about stones and chambers. We're arguing about lost knowledge, and whether ancient civilizations understood aspects of physics we're only beginning to rediscover. That idea makes scholars nervous, and rightly so. History is full of exaggerated claims and pseudoscience, but it's also full of moments where consensus was wrong. Troy was a myth until it wasn't. Meteorites were superstition until they fell from the sky. Continents were fixed until plate tectonics rewrote geology. The question isn't whether Egyptology is wrong, it's whether it's complete. And that brings us to the most dangerous part of this story, not because it's sensational, but because it forces us to confront our own assumptions. What if the Great Pyramid wasn't built for us to understand? What if its purpose wasn't symbolic, spiritual, or even practical, but informational? Once researchers step beyond the tomb versus machine debate, the discussion takes a sharper, more unsettling turn. Because some engineers and mathematicians began noticing that the Great Pyramid doesn't just do things, it also encodes things. Not in hieroglyphs, not in writing, but in proportion. The pyramid's geometry embeds mathematical relationships with remarkable consistency. The ratio of its perimeter to its height closely approximates 2 pi, linking the structure to the geometry of a circle. Its slopes reflect ratios associated with phi, the so-called golden ratio, long before it was formally defined. Skeptics argue these relationships are coincidental. After all, Large structures often produce interesting ratios. But coincidence becomes harder to defend when the pattern repeats across multiple measurements. The pyramid's dimensions also align with geophysical features of Earth. Its latitude, 29.979245 degrees north, numerically mirrors the speed of light in meters per second, 299,792,458. Now, to be clear, this does not prove ancient Egyptians knew the speed of light. But it raises a disturbing question. Why does a structure built in 2560 BCE encode values that only became meaningful thousands of years later? Some researchers suggest the pyramid functions as a time capsule of knowledge, using universal constants expressed through geometry rather than language, constants that would remain discoverable no matter how cultures or alphabets changed. This idea is controversial, highly controversial, but it has precedent. Carl Sagan once proposed that advanced civilizations might encode information into mathematics or physics because those languages are universal. Anyone capable of understanding geometry would eventually recognize the message. If that sounds speculative, it should. But the Great Pyramid invites speculation precisely because it refuses to fit neatly into historical categories. And then there's astronomy. The pyramid's orientation to true north is so accurate that it exceeds modern surveying methods until the advent of satellite GPS. Theories suggest its alignment was achieved using stellar observations, possibly of circumpolar stars that never set, symbols of eternity in Egyptian belief. But once again, the alignment is functional, not decorative. Precision matters, and precision requires purpose. Which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. The Great Pyramid appears to be built as if someone expected it to be measured, long after its builders were gone. Not worshipped, not inhabited. Measured, analyzed, decoded. That possibility reframes everything. If the pyramid's purpose wasn't just ritual and wasn't fully mechanical, then perhaps it served as a marker, a reference point anchored in stone, designed to survive catastrophe, erosion, and cultural collapse. A message across time. This idea resonates with fringe researchers who argue the pyramid predates Khufu entirely, that he merely restored or repurposed an older structure. Mainstream archaeology rejects this outright, citing lack of evidence, and they're right to be skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. But here's the uncomfortable truth. We don't actually know how the Great Pyramid was built. We don't know exactly how long it took. We don't know how many people worked on it. We don't know how stones weighing tens of tons were lifted with such precision. We have theories, good ones, but not certainty. And the pyramid remains silent, unlabeled, functionally ambiguous. Which brings us to the final question, the one that matters most. Not what the Great Pyramid is, but why it still matters now. Because whatever its original purpose, the pyramid continues to challenge our understanding of ancient capability, modern assumption, and the thin line between knowledge and belief. And that's where this story must end, not with answers, but with boundaries. What we know, what we don't, and what we may never know at all. This is the point in the story where things usually go off the rails. Lost civilizations, alien engineers, ancient power plants lighting up the Nile. You've heard these claims before, and most of them collapse under scrutiny. So let's be clear from the start. There is no credible evidence that extraterrestrials built the Great Pyramid. No non-human materials, no anomalous isotopes, no ancient texts describing visitors from the stars. Serious researchers reject those ideas outright, and so should we. But rejecting bad explanations doesn't mean the mystery disappears. It just means we're left with harder questions. Some fringe researchers argue the pyramid functioned as a power plant, generating energy through chemical reactions involving groundwater, zinc compounds, and acidic solutions. This idea, popularized by Christopher Dunn, suggests the Queen's Chamber may have housed reactants, producing hydrogen or electrical effects. Is there proof? No. There is no residue confirming chemical reactions, no pipes, no corrosion patterns that definitively support the claim. But there's also no evidence of burial activity. So the power plant theory sits in an uncomfortable gray zone, not proven, but not easily dismissed without replacing it with something better. Other theories propose the pyramid was designed as a seismic stabilizer, using its mass and geometry to dampen Earth vibrations along fault lines beneath the Giza Plateau. Modern engineers use similar principles in skyscrapers and bridges. This idea is intriguing because it requires no advanced technology, just empirical observation of how stone behaves under stress. But again, there's no ancient text confirming such intent. Then there are the acoustic ritual theories. Some researchers suggest the pyramid was used for sound-based ceremonies, chanting, resonance, or consciousness-altering experiences. Ancient cultures worldwide associated sound with creation, transformation, and divinity. The pyramid's chambers undeniably resonate. Sound behaves differently inside them. That's measurable. What's not measurable is intent. Were these acoustic properties exploited intentionally, or are they a byproduct of stone architecture? That's the line we can't cross without speculation. And finally, there's the most conservative alternative of all, yet still radical by Egyptological standards, that the Great Pyramid was a multi-purpose structure, not a machine, not a tomb, but a convergence of symbolism, science, ritual, and state power. A structure meant to reflect cosmic order, encode knowledge, and demonstrate absolute control over labor, materials, and mathematics. In this view, the pyramid wasn't meant to do one thing. It was meant to mean something, across dimensions we no longer fully grasp. This theory has an advantage. It doesn't require lost technology. It doesn't invoke aliens. It doesn't contradict known Egyptian culture. But it still forces us to admit something uncomfortable, that ancient civilizations may have understood geometry, resonance, and natural forces at a level we've underestimated, and that modern categories, tomb, temple, machine, may be too narrow to describe what the Great Pyramid actually is. Which brings us to the final reckoning. Because after all the scans, studies, theories, and debates, we're still left standing in the shadow of a structure that refuses to explain itself. And that silence may be the most important clue of all. After more than 4,500 years, the Great Pyramid of Giza still stands, silent, intact, and stubbornly resistant to simple explanations. So let's strip this back to fundamentals. What we know for certain. We know the Great Pyramid was built with a level of precision, scale, and material mastery unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. We know it contains no confirmed burial. It contains no funerary texts or inscriptions. Its internal chambers serve no clear ritual function. Its geometry and alignment are extraordinarily precise. Its materials, especially granite, were used strategically, not decoratively. Modern instruments show it interacts measurably with sound, stress, and electromagnetic waves. We know that in 2017, the Scan Pyramids project revealed a massive void, engineered, intentional, and still unexplained. And we know that none of these facts require conspiracy theories to exist. They're documented, measured, peer-reviewed. What we don't know why the pyramid has no inscriptions when every other royal monument does. Why its internal design prioritizes engineering over symbolism. Why later pyramids abandoned its precision instead of improving on it. Why a structure supposedly built for one man required such permanence. What the newly discovered void was meant to contain or do. We also don't know whether the pyramid's unusual physical behaviors were intended or merely emergent, a byproduct of monumental architecture. And that distinction matters, because intention is the line between coincidence and design. What they're not telling us. This is where skepticism becomes necessary. Not because archaeologists are hiding aliens or secret technologies, but because academic inertia is real. Once an explanation becomes canon, challenging it becomes risky. Funding dries up, careers stall, research paths narrow. It's easier to say, "We already know," than to admit, "We don't fully understand." And the Great Pyramid is the clearest example of that tension. It sits at the intersection of disciplines: archaeology, engineering, physics, geology, astronomy. No single field owns it, and that may be why it remains unresolved. Why this still matters. Because the Great Pyramid forces us to confront a deeper truth about history and ourselves. It reminds us that ancient people were not primitive. Knowledge doesn't always move forward in a straight line. Some understanding can be lost, not just gained. The pyramid doesn't tell us what to believe. It challenges us to ask better questions. Was it a tomb? Possibly. Was it more than that? Almost certainly. And the most honest answer, the one science rarely likes to give, is this: we don't know. But we should be curious, because every time we point a new instrument at the Great Pyramid, whether it's a muon detector, a laser scanner, or a resonance probe, it reveals something unexpected. Not magic, not aliens, but complexity. And complexity is the hallmark of serious engineering. The Great Pyramid may not have been designed for us to worship, or even to understand. It may have been designed to endure, to wait, to be questioned by civilizations thousands of years in the future, civilizations like ours. And in that sense, it's doing exactly what it was built to do.